We're inching closer and closer towards the exact kind of confrontation that countries have been trying to avoid since the last World War.
This was a difficult decision. I know there's a lot of peril in doing this, but I think it was the right thing to do.
Yet again, we see a war of choice, no clear strategy, no understanding of the cultural implication, no real effort to protect the people. What is left at the end of this could be 10 times worse as a consequence.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy in Tel Aviv, where we have started to see Iranian cluster missiles being intercepted by air defences here. But a week into this war, the Middle East is on fire. Qatar is warning today of global economic disaster, and the White House is pumping out propaganda videos of Hollywood memes to try and get its base enthused about the war in the face of some skeptical opinion polls. Joining me today, General Sir Richard Shirreff, former commander of NATO forces in Europe, who this week described Trump and Hegseth as a pair of gung-ho nutters. Professor Chimène Keitner is an expert in international law and formerly worked at the State Department as their international legal counselor during the first Trump term, and the former chief of staff in the National Security Council, Fred Fleitz, also joins us from the United States. Thank you all so much for joining us. Sir Richard, at the beginning of the week, you warned of your fears that this war could lead to a World War III. And you have also defended the Prime Minister from jibes from Donald Trump about him not being Winston Churchill. How do you feel about this war now?
I feel much the same as I did when I woke up on Saturday morning and heard the news that yet another American president has launched a war of choice in the Middle East without any clear end state, no strategy, and no idea how this war is going to end.
Do you still fear that this can lead to something much, much bigger, what you called a World War III?
Yeah, I mean, there are many, like President Zelensky, who said we're already in World War III. And the reality is, of course, that Europe is fighting a covert war with Russia, and Russia is fighting a covert war in Europe. And we've talked about that before in a separate context. But the potential knock-on effect of this war has already generated a regional war across the Middle East. And the potential for things to go south in a very big way should China, for example, take advantage of America being fixed in the Middle East to have a crack at Taiwan. And who knows what Putin might try to do to embarrass NATO at the same time. I mean, the potential scenarios are boundless.
How do you feel about the justifications that we've heard for the war this week?
Well, we seem to have flip-flopped from regime change to destruction of nuclear weapons, without any real clarity about the objectives, and then on top of that we get the propaganda feed. And let's be clear, from a purely military perspective, I mean, what America and Israel are doing in applying military force on an industrial scale, as any military man would tell you, is impressive. But it's more than that you need to think about. You need to have a thought. You need to think through the impact of what your operations are doing on the minds of the people among whom you're operating. And if you alienate the people, if you are looking to change the dynamic of what is a pernicious and vile regime in Iran, granted, but if you're trying to do that, you probably want to be able to apply a little bit of carrot at the same time as stick, and that doesn't seem to be happening.
And as a military man, are you concerned about the basis in international law for this, or do you accept that national interest trumps that?
You need to ask a lawyer. But the basics say that you've got to be prepared you have a right of self-defense. And you then need to ask what self-defense was being applied here. And of course, as the dynamic of this war develops, and every war has a dynamic of its own, that develops because of that gets even more complicated. But of course, Iran is now launching missiles at our British allies in the Middle East, launching missiles or drones at British air bases in Cyprus, and the right of self-defense applies there. But it's a very complicated thing, because the reality is as well that any nation lining up alongside America and Israel in this war is going to own the problem when the bombing stops. And I think it's highly likely, frankly, that when the bombing stops, Trump will declare victory, walk away, leave a smoldering pile of Iranian rubble. And those countries that have been alongside will be owning the problem for years to come.
Professor Keitner, let me bring you in. I'm sure you're more concerned about the basis in international law. If you were in the State Department still, would you be telling them they have a legal basis for action?
Well, legal advice, of course, depends on the questions being asked. And unfortunately, if I were in the State Department now, I don't think anyone in the White House would be listening to me. But I would say that the legal framework that applies to going to war is the UN Charter. We have a UN Security Council for a reason. And unless the Security Council has authorized the use of force, or the force is being used against an imminent threat, there is no legal basis.
Let's bring in Fred Fleitz then in the United States. I mean, criticisms on a number of fronts for you to pick up on there. Let's begin with international law. Are you not concerned that scholars and close allies like Britain don't think the initial attack was legal?
Well, I first want to talk about the justification for the war, which I think is pretty strong. President Trump said the U.S. has to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, has to stop a missile program that by the end of the year probably would have doubled in size and may have constituted a missile shield. That's what Secretary Rubio said this week, that would have prevented preemptive action against the Iranian nuclear program. And President Trump is providing a pathway for the Iranian people to take back their government. And for people to argue about international law, we all know nothing could be done about this in the UN Security Council because of vetoes by the Chinese and the Russians. So international law can't help these people. Will tens of thousands of them be executed again? Trump is giving them an opportunity. That's why the Australian, Canadian governments have endorsed this operation. That's why hundreds of thousands of Iranians in the Iranian diaspora have enthusiastically celebrated with mass demonstrations in London, in Berlin, in New York, in Los Angeles, because they see freedom. They see the end of an evil regime. They see an American president who had the courage to do something very difficult and not without giving the Iranians a diplomatic way out. So I think this was a difficult decision. I know there's a lot of peril in doing this, but I think it was the right thing to do.
But what do you make when you hear a man like General Sir Richard there, a former NATO commander, effectively saying, he doesn't know what the strategy is, he doesn't know what this is going to achieve, and he's very worried about where it's going to lead? Well,
I think there's clearly a strategy, which is one reason why we didn't start bombing in January after the massive crackdown on Iranian protesters. There was some time taken to plan this, but Joint Chiefs of Staff General Kane said operations like this are planned over many years. There's a lot of wargaming, there's a lot of planning done. And I think we're simply seeing the very early days of a 4 to 5 week operation to take out this regime, to destroy its offensive capabilities, hopefully to destroy security services, which will give the Iranian people an opportunity to take back their government. But look, neither the general or I know this full plan. The administration is not admitting to exactly what it is going to do publicly because they don't want to inform the Iranian regime.
So, Richard, what do you make of that?
Well, there's a bit to unpack there, isn't there? I mean, pathway for the Iranian people to take back their government. What is that pathway? How are you expecting bombed, traumatized people to step up against the IRGC and the Basij militia? And then you think back to the very action of assassinating Khamenei, who, on the one hand, of course, he was the head of state, but at the same time, he was a revered Shia cleric. And by doing that, what America and Israel have done is immediately promoted him to the ranks of the martyred saints and alienated Shia Muslims right across the world. And in doing that, what you're doing is most likely pushing any moderate Iranian who might be fed up to the back teeth with the theocracy and longing for a change, but you're going to harden opinion and most likely push them into the ranks of the hardliners. And this is Billy Basic stuff that anybody who served in that ill-starred operation in Iraq would understand. The need to get under the skin and understand the cultural implications of what you're doing. And instead of which, we're seeing mass industrial warfare, thumping Iranian cities, rubbling Iranian cities without any effort to try and reach out to the population. On top of which, we've just heard, of course, that Trump is demanding nothing but unconditional surrender. That doesn't sound to me like reaching out to the Iranian people to help them take back their government. And if I may, if this nuclear threat is so dire that by the end of the year, I think you said their nuclear weapons will double in size. Why is it?
I didn't say that. I said
Trump
missiles. I said missiles.
But why is it, nevertheless, why is it that America and Trump were boasting that last June the nuclear threat had been obliterated? If it was obliterated in June, my goodness me, they've done a lot to get to the stage where you've got to launch a war now to obliterate it once again.
Fred Fleitz?
Well, I think the nuclear program was obliterated last June, but since then, the Iranian government has been rebuilding its nuclear and missile programs. I think their missile program has been set back substantially, more than U.S. government officials are saying. But their missile program has made major advances. I think there's reliable intelligence that Iran is making up to 100 missiles a month. And according to Secretary of State Rubio, the plan for Iran is to use its missiles as a shield to protect attacks on the nuclear infrastructure, which might become impossible by the end of the year. I think an Iranian nuclear weapon is unacceptable, and that Iran is determined to build one, and that this may be our only opportunity to make sure that it doesn't.
And what about Sir Richard's point about the folly of the assassination of the Ayatollah in the way it was done? And what that does to the Shia population and moderate Iranian people who may be turnable?
The Ayatollah is incredibly unpopular in Iran, and the death of the Ayatollah is being celebrated across the country. About 20% of the country support this current regime. Most of them hate this regime. It has been so brutal. It's destroyed the economy. This is especially true among young people. I haven't seen any signs of a movement that is revering the Khomeini as a martyr right now. I'm sure that this 20% is very angry. I don't dispute that. But this is a leader who has destroyed this country. The vast majority of Iranians agree with that. That's why they were out celebrating after he was killed.
So, Richard, what would you say to that?
Well, you may be right, and they may have been celebrating, but of course they might be celebrating, but now then they're almost immediately taking cover from the mass bombings that are going on. And I think that, I stand by that principle that you have to understand the nature or the impact what you're doing on the minds of the people. And has that really been thought through? And I think to assassinate a major Shia figure during the holy month of Ramadan, as I said earlier in an earlier interview, is about as subtle as shooting the Pope on the steps of St. Peter's Cathedral, St. Peter's in Rome during Holy Week. It doesn't smack of sophisticated understanding, frankly.
This is a country that's been at war with our country for 47 years. It sent assassination squads into Europe to kill dissidents. It sent teams in the United States to capture and spirit back to Iran dissident journalists who had criticized Iran. This is a government that's been trying to assassinate the president of the United States. This is a government that is a terrorist state on a different level than other adversaries America has faced through history. I agree with you. I don't like the prospect of assassinating the leader of another state. And I think this is something that, frankly, if there was another way to do it, that isn't something I would have recommended. But I do think this is a special case.
What I'm concerned about is that what we seem to be hearing are a lot of ex-post talking points. One of the important features of our legal system and our international order is that countries have the ability to make the case for why they think force should be used, what diplomatic efforts have been tried, why those have failed. And what we utterly lacked in the lead up to this really surprise attack was any attempt at laying the foundation, bringing allies on board, and making the case. So I'm really not persuaded by any of these ex-post attempts to justify. Different members of the administration have come up with different rationales at different times. It seems like they weren't even talking to their own negotiators on the ground. We had a report right before the bombing started that negotiations were actually making progress. That's why we have a national security bureaucracy. I believe Fred was part of that as well. That's why you have advisors, including but not exclusively lawyers. And we have no confidence and no basis for confidence that any of that process, either internally or externally, took place. And that should worry everyone.
I mean, there was also a legal framework within the JCPOA, which Donald Trump pulled America out of. And they say it was failing. You know, is that where the limits of international law meet reality?
Well, I don't think we have any basis in that assertion about what the so-called reality was. Again, based on public reporting, the military generals in Israel actually thought the JCPOA was a great arrangement for going forward, or at least many of them publicly said that they did. What we're encountering here is not so much the limits of law, it's the unpredictability of politics and the lack of long-term strategic vision in the interests not only of the United States, but of a largely peaceful world order. Again, the number of wars raging in the world would surprise many people because a lot of them don't make the front pages. But we have so far managed to avoid a nuclear cataclysm. And what we're doing, Russia is now apparently providing intelligence to the Iranians. China is behind the scenes. We're inching closer and closer towards the exact kind of confrontation that countries have been trying to avoid since the last World War.
Fred Fleitz, I mean, there was, as the professor says, a legal framework. This was a choice to opt out of it and just go for a sort of a gung-ho strategy.
Well, there's people who believe, and idealists who think that there's ways to resolve things like this by going to the Security Council and laying out your case. But in the real world, that simply was never going to work. I think that if you're going to talk about international law and giving notice, the U.S. did engage in negotiations with Iran last year and this year. The Iranians would not agree to negotiate in good faith. They would not give up the uranium enrichment program, which is a weapons program. I know there's people who claim that it is not, but a nation with so much covert nuclear program can't be trusted with the uranium enrichment program, and the U.S. refused to let them have an enrichment program before the Obama administration. This was a bad concession by the Obama administration, which is why the JCPOA was frankly a fraud, and I'm glad that President Trump withdrew from it.
Well,
this is something.
But Europe believed it was working.
It wasn't working. And Iran was cheating on it. We know that from documents that Israel stole from the Iranians, the Iran Nuclear Archive in 2018. Iran was acquiring materials it wasn't supposed to have for nuclear programs. It was covertly developing advanced centrifuges, which is why it jumped so quickly to 60% enrichment in 2022. People who argue that it was working are frankly lying. It wasn't working. It was frankly delaying an Iranian nuclear weapon, but they were still going to get one. Trump is going to stop Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon. And you can argue, well, the UN isn't blessing this. I think justice for the Iranian people and stopping an Iranian nuclear weapon are moral, positive objectives that frankly are worth doing even if the UN says we shouldn't do it.
I'm pretty surprised to hear accusations of European leaders lying, but I think this is one of the problems of today's media environment.
Chimène Keitner, I mean, isn't the trouble that now that we're in this world in which it's the law of the jungle, might is right, you can do whatever you want, international law, who cares? It's very difficult to then put things back on a secure footing, because how do you then build a secure legal framework to create stability in the future?
I don't think that's the world we're in yet. I think that's the world that Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump are trying to create. I think that's the world that Vladimir Putin would like to live in. And I think the more that powerful countries act as if international law doesn't matter, the less it will. I never said that we would get Security Council authorization. What I said is that countries go and make their case ahead of time. They lay out the arguments for the use of force. Otherwise, if the basis for using force is potential assassination attempts, that turns right back around and gives other countries a green light to target the United States. And so we can go down this rabbit hole of, discarding legal frameworks. We also have very clear legal frameworks about the laws that apply to targeting. And I was reassured to hear Secretary Hegseth say that the United States does not target civilians. That's a very important bedrock principle. And there's absolutely no reason to throw it out the door. And if we do, the United States is going to ultimately actually be much the worse for it.
General Sir Richard, can I bring you in here on the targeting question? There are two very big incidents, and I wonder how you feel about them as a military man. There is the school, and it's not clear who hit it, but it looks like it might have been the Americans, but they say they weren't targeting it deliberately. And then there is the ship off Sri Lanka, which was on its way back from a sort of diplomatic exercise with India. There's some suggestion it wasn't even armed, and those sailors were killed. How do you feel about those two big incidents?
Well, that's the consequence of war. War is not a clean, clear-cut business. It's a dirty, vile, ruthlessly brutal, violent exercise. And sinking a ship and collateral damage or a failure to target correctly, and if there's and destroying a school, if that was the case, are the consequence of launching an attack on a scale along the lines of the one we are just witnessing. And if I may just pick up one of the tread carefully into the legal world, of course, the national security of the United States has stated quite explicitly that the international rules-based order is a cloud-based abstraction. That says to me that law doesn't matter, that might is right, and that's the end of it. That's the end of it.
I regret I have another interview, so I have to run, but it's nice to be with you all. I enjoyed this debate.
Okay, thank you, Fred Fleitz, for joining us. I'm sorry you have to go, but thank you for your time. Professor Keitner, what is the legality of these two big incidents that you can see so far?
We would need more facts in order to determine for sure. As Sir Richard says, mistakes do happen in war. The targeting of the boat it was clearly not a mistake. The targeting of the school appears to have been. But I was concerned about hearing this makes right. And again, I don't understand you to have been advocating that, but simply stating what you perceive to be the current reality. I mean, NATO troops, every country's troops are trained meticulously in the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict. And war is never humane, but we have long predating the United Nations system, very clear parameters for targeting, particularly because civilians can so often be the victims of war. And so what I would like to see from the United States, again, and this is something that prior administrations have done, whether or not you agree with the rationales they've put forward, they have been very transparent, or tried to be, in terms of explaining what happened, how it happened, and what they can do better next time. And so I think what the public deserves, both the Iranian public and all of those watching from around the world, are explanations. And those explanations are going to go a long way towards reassuring people that there actually is some sort of plan here, some sort of long-term vision, or it's going to reinforce the perception that I think so many of us observers have, that this is wildly out of control.
If I may make it 100% clear that when I say that the national security strategy, this is the American national security strategy recently published, describing the international rules-based order as a cloud-based abstraction. That is not my view. I am a soldier, and the law of armed conflict, the Geneva Convention, are all fundamental to the whole issue of just war theory, and the way this ghastly phenomenon of war can somehow be, if not controlled, at least ensure that the innocent do not suffer. But as soon as you start talking about the international rules-based order being an abstraction, you're effectively divorcing yourselves from the framework of the law of armed conflict and the Geneva Convention. And that is a very dangerous, slippery slope the Americans are going down by doing so.
Because obviously British troops are being drawn in. They're flying defensive missions rather than offensive missions. I don't know what the difference in real terms is if they're shooting at Iranian missiles and potentially positions in the future. What do you think the British position should be in the next weeks?
Well, this is the opportunity to pick up the line that Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada articulated so inspiringly in a way at Davos a couple of months ago now, when he talked about the international rules-based order may be fractured. He talked about the rupture with the United States, and he talked about the need for the middle powers to come together on a sort of pragmatic, values-based approach. And the middle powers are involved here. And this was the opportunity for Canada, for Germany, for Australia, for France, for Italy, other European powers to come together to protect their interests in the Gulf, to protect and to support their Gulf allies, but not to get involved in the prosecution of the war. Now, it's got much more complicated, because if there are Iranian drones flying against British bases in Cyprus, then you get the whole principle of self-defense comes in. And there is a right to self-defense. And if self-defense means targeting the missile launchers from which those drones or missiles are launched, well, that is a complication. But I would try and put as much clear water as possible between that role of self-defense, that mission of self-defense, and engaging with America and Israel. Because as I said earlier, at the end of the day, Trump's going to walk away from this. And anybody who has worked alongside and been part of that US-Israeli coalition will be left owning the problem. And there's going to be a problem for generations to come as a consequence of this.
Do you wonder what they've learned from Iraq?
No, clearly not. Clearly not. And that's the point I'm making again and again, that yet again we see a war of choice, no clear strategy, no understanding of the cultural implication, no real effort, no effort to try and build any form of civil society, reach out to civil society, no effort to protect the people. And this has, and you know, your previous guest who's left us now talked about the threat Iran has been posing. And yes, it has been a pernicious, vile, terrorist state. But what is left at the end of this could be 10 times worse as a consequence.
Well, and just to echo that Davos speech, I think I've been very disappointed to see the Canadian government throw its support behind the United States in the absence at this point of a direct threat to Canada. As Sir Richard says, I think the UK is in a much tougher position because of some of Iran's recent targeting, which, by the way, also very much violates international law to be targeting countries that are not part of this, or the installations of countries that are not part of this attack on Iran to begin with. And the UK absolutely does have a right of self-defense against those attacks. So this is precisely the concern that we have about the ripple effects of the United States starting something that is, as you opened this podcast with, it really has not shown any path towards how this could finish.
I mean, in terms of how it could finish, I suppose Donald Trump is again talking about how he wants to choose the Iranian leadership in the future. I mean, how can there be any sort of legal basis for that?
There isn't. Certainly, if there were to be a negotiated peace settlement, that could involve various prongs. It could involve United Nations peacekeepers. We've seen what different arrangements there are for post-conflict societies. But just one more indication of the lack of forethought here is that we've been told that a number of folks the United States had in mind as potential successors, again, not for the United States to choose, were also killed in the initial wave of bombing. And so, like Sir Richard, I'm extraordinarily concerned about what we're going to see internally. And it is not for any other country to determine what the Iranian regime will be. It is for other countries to identify threats, to push back with all lawful means against those threats, and to support democracy in Iran, again, through lawful means led by the people who are actually there and who are actually affected by this regime's actions.
Just finally, Sir Richard, can I ask you what you make of the communications and the language around this? I don't know whether you've seen any of the internet stuff that the White House is pushing out, but clips of Hollywood films, lots of sort of, gung-ho clips, pictures of bombs to music, Hegseth talking about Iran being toast. Has all dignity gone out the window?
Yes, it's tasteless in the extreme.
The callousness and nonchalance with which President Trump has discussed both U.S. fatalities, past and future, is also really unprecedented, I think, and is very much part and parcel of the Hollywoodification of what is a real war with real impacts.
Professor Chimène Keitner, General Sir Richard Shirreff, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's the forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.